I want to start though by thanking Colin for the invite, but also to thank the SSP for their involvement inside the Radical Independence campaign. When Colin mentioned the hotel there, it tells you something about the times that we live in, because when we went up to those hotels with not a pound in our pocket, I mean literally not a pound in the pocket, we did have an inclination that they would be popular, because there's a thirst for change. There is a thirst for a discussion about what sort of Scotland that we would have. And I've been instructed today to talk a bit about how living in Britain, how the framework of the British state and its institutions holds back workers in not just Scotland but UK-wide, and what we might do in Scotland to rescind decades of neoliberal attack and assault on working people. Now, just in starting that argument, I want to point out some elementary statistics about the state that we live in today. We have amongst the lowest state pensions in all of Europe. Our elderly people are the fourth poorest in all of Europe. We have amongst the worst child poverty rates, not just in Europe, but amongst the whole of the industrialised world. And more than that, we are second worst in terms of fuel poverty. Think about that for a second. Second worst in terms of fuel poverty, when the resources of Scotland are abundant in that regard. This could go on. There are statistics after statistics which highlight just how much the people of Britain have been failed by the British regime. And inequality is at the height, I think, and at the pinnacle, I believe, of a global discussion about how our society and about how our global economy is run. Oxfam produced a report recently, which I'm sure many of you saw, that said that the top 85 richest people have a combined wealth greater than the bottom 3.5 billion people combined. Just to put that in some form of context, 85 people fits on a double-decker bus. So next time you're on a crowded double-decker bus, just imagine that that combination in terms of their wealth would amount to 3.5 billion of the poorest in our world. And in a domestic level, it's important to point out just how that inequality marks itself out in Britain. In Britain, the top 200 richest people now have a combined wealth of 318 billion pounds. I always stagger and I always stutter when repeating that number, because it always seems to be unbelievable. But perhaps what's more unbelievable is that that number, that figure, £318 billion, has actually increased by 10 times since 1989. This is not an act of nature, this is by design. This is the way that our society and that our economy has been geared to work, and therefore it's no surprise that CEOs, the top CEOs in this country, had to work less than 2 days into 2014 before they earned more than the average wage of a skilled worker earns an entire year in Britain. That's where we are. And you know, there's been a lot said about food banks as an example to hold up about just how bad the situation has got. Not only is it thousands of people, but hundreds of thousands of people now reliant on food banks, maybe more than hundreds of thousands. I'll need to check the statistics. But what does it tell you when it's not just people relying on food banks, but people can't actually afford the transport to get to the food bank to get the food? Now that tells you that we are now in a situation of rapid decline, and I believe of a decline that's unstoppable if we remain within the framework of the United Kingdom. Austerity is not just a strategy, austerity is an ideological attack on everything that has been won by working people since 1945 and throughout the post-war boom. Any sense of there being a framework of social security is now being removed, not just practically, but ideologically. It's not just that they're cutting the funds, it's that they're cutting out, as far as they possibly can, the belief, the ideal that people should be looked out for, the ideal that our most vulnerable in our society should be supported. That's what's happening. And it seems to me that the wealth of a tiny elite is increasing throughout this process, because it's not just a process of cuts, it's a process of privatisation. And all privatisation is extracting public wealth and putting it into the hands of a tiny minority of people. That's what we've seen with the privatisation of the Royal Mail, for example. So Britain has failed its people, but Britain is also failing. And the two mean different things. It's not just that the people of Britain are going through all of the turmoil that we've been through over the last number of years, and I believe are going to continue into the forthcoming years. But the institutions of Britain are failing as well. There's a crisis gripping not just Westminster, but banking, finance, and not just those sectors, but the police as well. The institutions of the British state are gripped in crisis. Now, we're seeing take place in England a reflection of this, because, particularly in England, but not just limited to England, what's happening is that in order to rationalise the failures, in order to rationalise the decline of the British state, the establishment are pointing the finger, as they always do, at the immigrants. They're pointing the finger at those who claim benefits. They're pointing the finger at the vulnerable in our society. That's what they're doing. But they're not just doing it because this is something that they've always done in the past and it's something to do with divide and rule. Though it is, they're doing it to rationalise, to create a narrative around the decline of the British state that props them up, that buffets their power, because Team GB doesn't cut it. There is no narrative that surrounds the British state which unites the people of Britain. And that's why we are seeing the rise of forces like UKIP in England in particular. Now, this is a situation, as I've already said, that I think is going to intensify. And it seems to me that the fear that's been permeating the No campaign is directly connected to the fear-mongering that's being raised by Westminster and by the establishment in Britain. Now, it begs a question. Why in these circumstances would you vote to extend the life cycle of this current framework? If you're interested in progressive politics, if you're interested in creating a society where we look out for one another, why would you elect to fight a campaign on the basis of a no vote? And this is where I think we have to think about the Labour Party in particular. Because the Labour Party could be making an argument that says, let's stay as part of the United Kingdom in order that we can fund a world-class social security system, and here's a roadmap for how we would do that under the existing parameters of the United Kingdom. But they don't do that. In the Scottish Parliament, they rely on the corporate argument for the union. They rely on the CEOs, on Shell, and of all of these forces coming out for a no vote. That's the first point. But the second point is that they are getting really worried, I believe, because no matter what happens in this referendum, the Labour Party have ganged up with the Tories and with the Lib Dems every step of the way throughout this referendum. But what they've also done is they forgot about who they're talking to, because they're using the argument of the corporate elites and of the wealthy. They forgot about their own base, and it was little surprise that when we put a campaign into the press that said Britain's for the rich and that Scotland's for Scotland can be ours, that the Labour Party attacked that slogan. They said it was, what was the quote, something like, this was appalling behaviour, and did the Yes campaign sign these woeful tactics off and all that sort of thing. And there's a reason why they were worried, because at the launch of that campaign, at what we're calling a mass canvass, 80 people turned up in Easter House in Glasgow, one of the poorest places, not just in Glasgow but in the whole of the UK, to go around and to canvass people, to talk and to say to people, to say to people that actually their opinions counted and that their opinions mattered. 30 or 35 of those people had never done campaigning in their life, had never been to canvassing before. So when we said, right, put your hand up if you've never done this before, we expected a couple of people that would pair up. Almost half the crowd puts their hand up. Now, these are people who the Labour Party would have been recruiting in decades gone by. These are the sorts of things the Labour Party would have been doing in decades gone by, and it's why we've got to the stage, as has been pointed out, that you've got such an erosion of the talent that used to reside inside the Labour Party, used to be attracted towards the Labour Party, so that now you've got people like Anasawa who are in the leadership of that organisation. But why mention the Labour Party in particular? Because I think it refers to what Jean was talking about when she mentioned the question of there being a movement. The Labour Party, as we know, was formed out of a movement. And we also know that movements have played an important role in our politics in the last number of years. If you look, for example, at the number of people that opposed the war, which as we all know, was carried out by a Labour leader. If you look at the number of people that now oppose the destruction of our public services, if you look at the fact that up and down Scotland you are seeing whatever meeting it is, it could be a Yes meeting, an SSP meeting, a RIC meeting, it doesn't seem to matter what it is, that if you put a leaflet out that talks about independence and that relates it to the point and to the question of social change, then you'll get a turnout. And I think it's because people now are beginning to realise that actually voting no, then voting Labour just isn't a solution. Now, it's obvious for a lot of people in this room it's not a solution because, well, we're socialists, we're people of the left. But actually for millions of people right over the island, right over the British Islands, you would have to accept that the votes of the Labour Party have actually, despite everything, managed to hold up reasonably well. And it seems to me now that that's breaking down, in particular in Scotland, and that's why independence and voting yes isn't just a vote for the working class in Scotland, it is also a vote for the working class in England. Because the best thing that we can do, the most important thing that we can do, I think, in terms of working class representation, is to say that the Labour Party isn't cutting it. We need to start that process. We need to start the process, and there's different strategies around that. One strategy will be that we're in the process of breaking down the Labour establishment that the Labour Party might be reclaimed. That's one strategy. Another strategy might be that actually we need to create alternatives, that there needs to be other parties and so on and so forth. But regardless of what point of view you take on those particular strategies, there is unity on one point, and there's unity around the question that independence can't just be a changing of the flags. And here's where I want to make my concluding remarks. There's a particular reason why Britain's went the way it's went, and I think it's summed up in one word, and it's a word that sounds like jargon, but actually is really simple, and that's financialisation. It's because we've got an economy that's not related to real jobs, to production. It's because we've got an economy that is instead based on making a quick buck, like the sharks we see in the City of London. It's because we've got an economy that refuses to invest in long-term, socially useful jobs, that refuses to recognise the importance of those jobs being run by trade union labour, for example, that we are seeing plummeting living standards at the same time as we are seeing rising and intensifying inequality. Now, there will be a choice after a yes vote as to what direction we're going to go down. Are we going to go down a path that's essentially going to mirror what's happened in the City of London? And if we do that, we're going to be no better off. The only reason that we will be better off in those circumstances is that at the very least we'll get to vote for the government that we decide on. And that's a good thing. But it will relinquish the potential that an independent Scotland actually has. Make no mistake, I fundamentally believe, and I think this is becoming more and more obvious, that Scotland now is at the front line of the battle of ideas in terms of the international question about how you're going to run a society. Are we going to run a society that actually has social security, that has investment in jobs, not just in apprenticeships, but also, if you look at, for example, the university departments that are being shut down, philosophy, sociology, history. Why? Because they don't feed into the market. We shouldn't just be a society that says, there you go, if you're from a working class background, go and do an apprenticeship. We should have both apprenticeships, but also the encouragement that says, if you want to be a philosopher, if you want to be a historian, then we are going to create a framework around which that can be made possible. And the last comment really is this. The slogan, Britain is for the rich, and Scotland can be ours, is an attempt, I suppose, to encapsulate this. Britain is for the rich, that's a fact. The framework of Britain is a fact, that it stands up for the rich and supports the wealthy. Scotland can be ours is important. I think the most important word though is can. It can be ours, and it's going to take a movement which is diverse, but which is progressive in order to deliver those goals. And the very last point I just wanted to make very briefly. People often talk about the United States, Britain's relationship with NATO and all that sort of thing. See, these aren't just political choices made by individual governments. It's precisely because we've got an economy in Britain based purely on finance that alliance with the United States is so important, because without it, our economy is in trouble. That's why an independent Scotland, if it's to be truly independent, of the City of London, truly independent of decades of alliance and special relationship foreign policy with the United States, then we also need to be independent from the economic dogma that has dominated political and economic life in Britain for too long. That's why not only voting yes, but fighting after yes for the sort of society that we want to live in is not only a worthy thing, but I think necessary as the situation worsens for ordinary people.